The film begins with a guy named Frank Moses. Frank used to be a top-secret spy for the CIA, but now he's just chilling and enjoying a quiet life. Every now and then, he chats with a lady named Sarah, who works at a place that handles pension money. It's pretty clear Frank has a bit of a crush on her, and he always calls her up when he gets his retirement money. This time, he decides it's time to shake things up, cause he's going to meet her in person in Kansas, which makes Sarah quite jittery. One early morning, Frank's peaceful life takes a wild turn. He notices some armed guys sneaking up on him, but he's one step ahead, grabbing some bullets and a gun he had stashed away just in case. Soon after, the soldiers bust into his house ready to attack, but Frank is ready for them, leading to his house getting completely wrecked in the confrontation. After this, Frank hits the road to Kansas. When he gets there, he gives Sarah a big shock by showing up at her house out of nowhere. She's so startled that she starts throwing stuff at him. Frank quickly tries to soothe her, telling her that some bad people are after them and they need to get out of there, pronto. Before she knows it, she's in the back of a speeding car, a bit miffed with Frank, and with her mouth sealed with tape as they zoom down the highway to escape danger. In another part of the story, a CIA guy named William is busy setting up a scene to take down his next target. His boss, Cynthia, hands him a new mission that he's got to eliminate Frank. Switching scenes, Frank and Sarah have now popped up in New Orleans. At that time, Frank has Sarah stay in a hotel room while he steps out to handle some business. He actually goes to see his old teacher and buddy Joe, who lives in a nursing home now. Then Frank fills Joe in on the scary attack he faced from some hitmen. After hearing that, Joe pieces the puzzle together and tells Frank that those guys are from Africa and might be the same ones who killed a reporter in New York recently. Knowing that, Frank can't wrap his head around why all of this is happening to him now, after he's retired. Back at the hotel, Sarah somehow gets out of the room and dials 911 for help. But this move alerts William to their exact location. Soon after, the police are at the hotel and are about to take Sarah away, when one cop turns out to be a baddie. He tries to inject something into her, but just in time, Frank comes to the rescue and stops him. But they barely have a moment to breathe before shots start raining out around them. At that time, Frank really kicks it up a notch with his daring moves, causing William to step back for a bit. But William isn't giving up that easily and tails them secretly. He decides to investigate a police car parked at the roadside, which Frank was using earlier, but finds himself caught by the police instead. Meanwhile, back at the nursing home, things aren't looking good for Joe, as a CIA agent is closing in on him with harmful intentions. In another scene, Sarah comes to after fainting and is surprised to find out that they've zipped all the way to New York. There, Frank insists that they need to stick together until he figures out who's after him. Their next stop is the house of the reporter who was killed recently. They meet his heartbroken mom, and Sarah has a warm chat with her. The mom hands over a postcard that has a mysterious number written on the back. Using this hint, Frank and Sarah head to a library at the university the reporter graduated from. There, amidst books on Asian literature, they stumble upon a list of names in a book. Turns out, everyone on that list is dead, except for a guy named Gabriel Singer. Then, Frank tries to call Joe to ask about Gabriel, but the call takes a sad turn when he finds out that Joe is no longer alive. Meanwhile, over at the CIA office, William is being nudged by Cynthia to dig into Frank's classified files to understand who he is dealing with a bit more. Henry, the guy who takes care of all the files, chimes in, mentioning that Frank was quite the star in his agent days, really skilled and experienced. But now in his retirement, he's been stamped with a red label, meaning he's considered retired extremely dangerous. Yeah, they think he's still a big threat, even in his golden years. On the other hand, Frank and Sarah have zoomed off to Florida. They're on a mission to find a guy named Marvin, a retired agent like Frank, whose name popped up on that ominous list they found. Soon after, Frank tells Sarah that Marvin is a bit of a drama king, often pretending to be dead as a ruse. Not long after, they get to Marvin's place via a speedy boat ride and are greeted quite dramatically by Marvin himself, gun and all. Fun fact, Marvin and Frank used to be enemies, assigned to knock each other out at one point. There, Marvin welcomes them into his home, which is sneakily tucked away underground. Then, Frank hands over the list of names they've gathered to Marvin, who is pretty jittery and high-strung. Shortly after, Marvin dashes into another room and quickly comes back with files about some secretive operation in Guatemala. When Sarah mentions that a guy named Gabriel is the only one still breathing from that list, Marvin gets all hyped up and animated. Soon after, Frank and Marvin were chilling at a dockside eatery, having a chat. There, Frank assured Marvin that Sarah was trustworthy, brushing off Marvin's doubts about her. Sarah then showed up, bringing news about where they could find Gabriel. Without wasting time, they jetted off to Alabama. Once they landed, Marvin, being his usual jittery self, nabbed a lady he found suspicious. Thankfully, Frank was there to show that Marvin had got it all wrong, and then they finally bumped into Gabriel. There, Gabriel seemed ready to spill the beans about a hush-hush operation he was part of in Guatemala. But before he could get all the details out, Marvin, spooked again, noticed a helicopter nearing them. Panic set in, and they all bolted as bullets started raining down from the helicopter, making a swift getaway from the danger. When they got to the place with all the big storage containers, they suddenly found themselves under attack from a bunch of agents packing heat. Frank managed to whip out a rocket launcher hidden inside a doll Marvin was toting around. William was overseeing the relentless assault, forcing the trio to constantly dodge danger. At one point, Marvin bravely squared off with a female agent who was armed with a bazooka, leading to a fiery exchange of gunfire. At the same time, William seemed pretty freaked out by the explosions happening left and right. Then, before the cops could show up, Frank and his friends made a quick exit. As they hit the road, Frank and Marvin shared some sweet, friendly banter and discussed where to head next and who they could call for backup. Soon after, their journey took them to the Russian embassy next, aiming to meet up with Ivan, a guy who used to be in the Russian Secret Service. Frank went in solo and hung around in an interrogation room waiting for Ivan. When Ivan showed up, they had a heart-to-heart, reminiscing about the days they were enemies. At that time, Ivan was pleasantly surprised when Frank revealed that instead of killing Ivan's nephew during a past encounter, he'd given him a stern lesson. With a newfound camaraderie, Frank asked Ivan if he could lend a hand in sneaking into the CIA headquarters, to which Ivan agreed. Not long after, Frank and Sarah found themselves sneaking into the CIA headquarters, trying to keep a low profile. However, things got a bit nerve-wracking in the elevator when a contact lens, crucial for their plan, slipped from Sarah's grasp. But with a cool head, she managed to locate it, and Frank quickly popped it in to get past a security scan. Their next stop was the room where all the top-secret files were kept, and they were greeted warmly by Henry. Turns out, Henry didn't just hand over the files on the Guatemala operations, cause he also gave Frank a heads up that William was nearby, searching for his profile files. Soon after, things escalated quickly when Frank swung by William's office, resulting in a bit of a brawl. Making a quick exit with William's ID card, Frank suddenly found the whole place hot on his heels. After reuniting with Sarah, they got a bit crafty, concocting an explosive mixture from cleaning supplies they found on one of the floors. Posing as a firefighter thanks to a swiped uniform, Frank managed to stroll out of the building without raising suspicion. At that moment, their getaway vehicle was waiting outside, with Marvin at the helm of an ambulance sporting a bloody nose. And surprise, surprise, Joe was in the back, very much alive. It seemed he had flipped the script on the CIA agent sent to kill him, taking the agent out instead and staging his own death as a cover-up. Meanwhile, things took a grim turn for William as Cynthia ended up killing him, blaming him for Frank's successful break-in and getaway at the headquarters. After that, the group made their way to a place called Eagle's Nest to meet up with Victoria, a retired assassin from Britain who now occasionally takes on hired killing gigs. There, she took a moment to tend to Frank's gunshot wound, and they shared a light chat about how life's been treating them since they stepped back from their previous roles. During this, Frank realized that his life had gained a new sparkle since meeting Sarah. As they caught up, they also brainstormed their next moves, which involved having a face-to-face with Alexander Dunning, a big shot in the military contractor world and a name they found in the CIA's secret files. While this was happening, there was a twist in William's story that he was actually alive and was quietly keeping an eye on his kids as they slept when he got a heads up from Cynthia about Frank and the crew's whereabouts. He even let them know that the FBI was already keeping an eye on Alexander's place. Victoria also noticed this while she was scoping out the place. Putting their heads together, the group came up with a plan that Frank, Marvin, and Joe would get into disguises and infiltrate, while Victoria and Sarah would hold down the fort from a distance, keeping a watchful eye as snipers. Soon after, Joe met up with Alexander and managed to lure him into a private room with a recorded voice message, a trick to keep any spies off their scent. Meanwhile, Frank and Marvin didn't waste any time pinning Alexander down in a corner and grilling him for answers. After a bit, Alexander spilled the beans about his role in the shady operations happening in Guatemala. Surprisingly, the whole Guatemalan scheme and a connected murder case traced back to Vice President Robert Stanton, who seemed to be using these dark secrets to pave his path to a presidential run. But the ruse didn't last long. The FBI caught onto the trick because of the delayed voice recording from Alexander's end. They quickly made moves to encircle Alexander's place, a development Victoria promptly shared with her teammates. At the same time, William made it to the scene. He got on the line with Frank, trying to convince him to give up peacefully by stepping out the front door. With no other options in sight, Frank agreed to the proposition. But when Frank was supposed to emerge, a startled William found himself running towards Joe, who had been shot instead. Meanwhile, Frank and Marvin had managed a sneaky exit through a side window. While covering for her fleeing friends, Victoria told Sarah to make a run for it. But things took a bad turn when Sarah tripped and got nabbed by the FBI. Meanwhile, Frank, Marvin, and Victoria were pleasantly surprised when Ivan showed up to whisk them away to safety, taking them to his secluded cabin. There, they gathered their thoughts and started thinking about their next move. At that time, Frank couldn't shake off his worries about Sarah and what might be happening to her. Seeing Frank's distress, Ivan offered him some wisdom on love. Soon after, a bit of gossip surfaced that Ivan and Victoria used to be a thing back in the day, and turns out Ivan still harbored feelings for her even though they had been separated for quite a while. At another location, William was attentively listening in on Sarah's questioning session. Out of the blue, he got a call from Frank, who threw in a threat to make him ponder his actions. At that time, William freaked out upon realizing Frank was calling from his home, threatening harm to his family if anything happened to Sarah. Caught in this tight spot, he assured he would look out for Sarah while Frank went ahead with his scheme. Quickly heading back home with a police escort, William was overcome with relief to find his family unharmed. However, he discovered a highly confidential document left on his table by Frank. Not wasting any time, he zipped back to the headquarters, intending to get some answers from Sarah, only to find she wasn't willing to cooperate with him. Meanwhile, Frank and Marvin were at Frank's place, sorting through an arsenal of weapons stashed in his garage, gearing up for their mission in Chicago to target the vice president. In the Windy City, William melded with the extra security team, ramping up safety measures at a fundraiser graced by the vice president. But Frank and the gang weren't deterred cause they had a foolproof plan to infiltrate the event. With a flirty dance and hints of rekindling their romance, Victoria and Ivan sprang into action. Creating a chaotic scene, Ivan released a gas into the event hall, sending guests into a frenzy. Then, the security personnel quickly initiated a plan to evacuate the president, but they found their path blocked by Victoria, who had locked the main doors and incapacitated the guards. There, they found an alternative exit, hustling the president into a vehicle. However, before they could make their getaway, Victoria appeared, guns blazing, attacking the procession of cars. While the chaos of the firefight kept going in the parking lot, Ivan made a loud entrance by blowing up a fancy car. Soon after, William rushed to the scene with his team, his heart racing as automatic gunfire echoed around them. Meanwhile, the vice president was being hurriedly ushered through the kitchen by the security team, but guess who was there to greet them? Yep, it was Victoria, ready to halt their progress again. But things took a tense turn. As Victoria and Marvin were ready to move on after holding back the security team, the police started firing at them. At that time, Victoria got hit, which threw Marvin into a panic. Without thinking twice, he used a smoke bomb to create a diversion and started dragging her to safety. But only a little way off, Victoria insisted on going her separate way, not wanting to slow him down. Caught in a dead end with no clear way out, Victoria seemed unsure of what to do next. But just in the nick of time, Ivan smashed through the fence and scooped her up to safety. Meanwhile, Marvin put on quite the display in front of the vice president, now decked out with explosives strapped to his chest. However, the vice president and his bodyguards didn't stick around, darting towards a waiting limousine. At that time, they thought they were about to make a clean getaway, but then William showed up, desperately trying to prevent the lame-o from speeding away, throwing himself onto the roof of the moving vehicle. On the other hand, Frank had a plan. He took the vice president to an old, abandoned electricity office, planning to exchange him for Sarah, just like he had promised William. Without wasting time, William got moving, instructing the CIA and a security team to accompany Sarah to where the exchange was going to happen. Soon after, William reached the spot where Frank was already waiting. A bit later, a vehicle rolled up carrying Sarah, but that wasn't all. Turns out Cynthia and Alexander were in there too, confessing that they were the real brains behind all the deadly schemes going on, manipulating William with the promise of a high position at the CIA. Then things took a twist when William was told to handcuff Frank. He played along, but sneakily passed the handcuff keys to Frank at the same time. It was clear that William was fed up with Cynthia. After being reunited, Frank embraced Sarah tightly, and one by one, their pals started showing up. A bit of a surprise to everyone, Frank handed the handcuffs back to William, even thanking him for his part. At that time, William decided to let them walk away, vowing to clean up the gigantic mess they were all in. As they left, Frank and his group couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Their faces lit up with joy since no one was chasing them now. But the adventure wasn't over cause Ivan reminded Frank that he owed him a favor in the form of a new mission to accomplish. Next thing you know, Frank and Marvin are sprinting across a field, trying to dodge an explosion. They found themselves being pursued by soldiers from Moldova, and as they ran, the screen fades to black. The film ends. The moral lesson from this film is when your retirement gets a little too boring, just rekindle old rivalries, expose government conspiracies, and blow stuff up for some excitement.